Here's our Bible reading. So we're reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Great to have you with us again this morning. Like you've heard, my name is Matt, if we don't know each other. And I'm one of the leaders here at MCC. And this morning, I'll be picking up on a sermon series that we began all the way back to last year, when we began our online services. Actually, during lockdown, we embarked on a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, possibly the most well-known of all of Jesus's teaching. So last year, like I said, during lockdown, we spent many weeks on this. But even then, we only just made it past the Beatitudes, which most people regard as the initial introduction to the entire sermon. So we barely scratched the surface. We covered up to Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 17, which is the famous reminder to be both salt and light, and the injunction not to lose that saltiness or to hide our light underneath a bushel. And in the not too far distant future, we're going to be covering the famous "You have heard it said, but I tell you" series of passages as well. And so they're the fairly, again, well-known and famous passages that cover off fun topics such as murder, adultery, retaliation, and divorce. So that's coming up in the near future too. But before we go any further, I wanted just to introduce this idea that's going to be permeating a lot of this talk, and that is the idea of freedom, what we mean by freedom. So I'm just going to fast forward a bit to this slide here. Freedom. This is a guy called Sebastian Junger, and his latest book is called Freedom. It's doing the rounds at the moment. He's a pretty fascinating guy. He's in his, I think, late 50s now, late 50s, but he started off life as a reporter and moved into becoming a war correspondent. So he's most famous for his books, The Perfect Storm, which got made into a big Hollywood movie, The Perfect Storm, all about deep sea fishing, I think fishermen in Alaska and how dangerous that is. And also wrote a book called War, which was based on his experience being a war correspondent during one of the Afghanistan conflicts in a place, I think it was called the Krangle Valley, that received more, face-to-face direct combat than just about any other place during the Afghanistan war. So he lost friends. He wasn't fighting, obviously, he was observing, but he lost friends that he made there who were combatants. And also later on in life, lost a comrade who was a fellow war correspondent, I think in 2011. So as a result, after all of that, one of the things that he did to try to I suppose, heal himself and deal with that grief was embark on a 400-mile walk through the American heartland with 3 other companions. But the thing that made this interesting is that he went via train tracks. He followed train tracks all through the States. And it turns out in the States, walking on the rails or near the rails is actually illegal. It's illegal, and they have cops there, as in, I think they're called Amtrak cops, who are there to make sure that no one is trespassing on federal property. So he lived the life of a vagrant, effectively. Him, 3 friends, for a year, 400 miles with a dog, and walked along these train tracks as a way. And his 3 friends, his comrades, were all veterans, combat veterans as well. So pretty amazing experience, and put down some of his reflections in this book called Freedom. And it's only a short book, but it's full of really kind of helpful and telling anecdotes. And one of them was, he tells a story about how they spotted this guy who was on the tracks, like an older white male on the tracks, and they watched him for about half an hour through binoculars, because again, they just wanted to make sure that he wasn't rail police, and they judged that he wasn't. So they walked up this guy. So you got 4 guys who look like nomads, who look like vagrants, approaching this complete stranger, and the stranger asked them what they're doing, and they said, well, we're just walking across America following the train tracks. And this guy goes, give me half an hour and I'll come back and join you. I want to go with you. And he didn't even know where they were going. He didn't know them from a bar of soap, but he was like, just give me half an hour. I don't mind the cold, because it was the middle of winter. They were sleeping rough every single night, dodging both authorities as well as sometimes some local yokels. And he was like, no, I'll drop everything and come with you. And Junger observed, it was just remarkable. He said, first of all, you've got a guy in what's regarded as the most free country on earth who thinks he's going to leave all those freedoms because he's not really free and become a vagrant with a bunch of random strangers. Secondly, this guy, he's got no idea as to what he's signing up for. He thinks that what we're doing is free. He doesn't really know the costs and the constraints involved in tramping around America for a year either. So one of his big points in this book that we'll come back to later is that we often don't really recognise and correctly identify what freedom entails. That's one of his big points. So freedom, think about that as we traverse through this passage. Okay, so 4 verses that we're going to cover. 4 verses. And there's so much packed in these 4 little verses. And they're super important. So most commentators seem to land on these verses being particularly important because of 2 big reasons. First of all, there's what Jesus claims about himself over the course of these 4 little verses. The claims that he makes primarily implicitly about who he is and his identity. But also, these 4 verses tell us so much about how Jesus read the Old Testament and how we should read the Bible as a result. So those 2, again, themes will come up a lot over these next 4 verses. First verse, Matthew 5:17, if you happen to have your Bibles with you. And this is from the ESV. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So it's obviously a claim about fulfillment. Jesus is making a claim about fulfillment. But first of all, what's meant by that phrase, law and prophets? This is really just shorthand for the entire Old Testament up to that point. So the Jewish scriptures, starting from Genesis, that at the time Jesus and his peers would be oh so familiar with. They would have grown up with them. They would have been, pretty much baked and basted in them. So that's what we mean by the law and the prophets, the Old Testament. So we've established that Jesus explicitly is saying he hasn't come to abolish those, to get rid of those whatsoever. He's not dispensing with the Old Testament. Instead, he's going to fulfill it. But what on earth does fulfillment mean? So Scott McKnight, one of the guys who's written a great commentary on this, he says it means this. He says the word fulfillment is used emphatically in Matthew specifically, so the gospel where we find this version of the Sermon on the Mount, to refer to the salvation, historical, theological and moral story of Israel coming to completion in Jesus. And then you'll see like his larger quote there. Fulfill or complete, that's another word, means that history has come to its fulfillment in Jesus himself. And other commentators say that this term has elements of drawing out and filling up, if you like. But all this stuff still sounds a little kind of confusing and potentially pompous to me. So trying to get it straight in my head, I think we can kind of sum up fulfillment as completing or finishing, if you like, the Old Testament story. And Jesus becoming, if you like, the centerpiece of history as a result. So completing, finishing the Old Testament story, and Christ becoming the centerpiece of both that and history as a result. But that still kind of begs the question, how does that fulfillment take place? So does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament, for example, through meeting all the many obligations of the law that we find in the Old Testament perfectly? Is that how he fulfills it? So he does what Adam and every other human since was never able to do, lived a perfect moral life in the eyes of God. Is that what we mean by fulfillment? Or does it mean that he fulfilled the Old Testament through all the predictive prophecies that were made about him coming to pass? Is that how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament? And the commentators that I read stressed that it's all of the above and more. It's not simply one of those or the other. Instead, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament in rich and numerous ways, not just one or two. So he actually, again, he brings more to the story, if you like, than one single track of fulfillment. But the larger, probably most kind of shocking element to this verse wasn't so much about what's meant by fulfillment, but how much of an audacious, staggering claim it is. Because the authority that Jesus appeals to here in terms of that fulfillment, it isn't secondhand. It's not the same kind of authority that the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the day would draw upon when they were interpreting Scripture. It's his own authority. So he's effectively claiming in this verse to be the long-awaited Messiah, so Jewish king, that the Old Testament pointed to. And he's staking this claim against simply on his own authority. That takes a whole lot of pluck. So Scott McKnight, the commentator, suggests that the big takeaway when it comes to this verse, just this one little verse here, is that when it comes to the Bible, the first thing for us is to remember that Jesus is its central story, both Old and New Testament. The big takeaway is that when it comes to reading the Bible and interpreting it, the central theme, the big character, is Jesus. He is central to the story, both Old and New. So that's 17. Next, 18. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So what is Jesus doing here? At the very least, he's got to be reiterating that everything in the Old Testament is true. So Don Carson, another well-established commentator, says that Jesus is making it clear with these words. He has what they call a high view of the Old Testament. So with this declaration, he's upholding both its reliability and its truthfulness. He's saying that he takes the Old Testament supremely seriously. And it's hard to argue with that kind of interpretation, as Christ was seemingly at pains to point out that no detail was going to be changed in the Old Testament. So no detail. So that was down to the iotas, the dots, the jots, or the tittles, depending upon your translation of this verse. But the point is, any detail was not going to be altered. But this is where it gets really tricky. Because if Jesus is saying that nothing is going to be altered, and it all still stands, the Old Testament stands, why does he seemingly abolish the Old Testament food laws a little bit later on in Matthew? Why does he call all foods clean? Or why do we see later in the book of Acts, Peter, the Apostle Peter, is told by God explicitly to kill and eat creatures that were deemed unclean in the Old Testament? Or why do the New Testament writers go on to say that the Old Testament sacrificial system has been done away with? And why do so many Christians these days, myself included, rock tattoos? How can you both say that the Old Testament still stands in its entirety, but still suffer all these different changes? And what does that mean for our relationship with the Old Testament? There are, as you can appreciate, a whole lot of different explanations for this, and grab me afterwards if you want to go into some of the options. But it was Scott McKnight's that I found the most convincing. He says this, a great point. He says the issue isn't whether the Old Testament is still credible or not, but it's how it is taught and interpreted. So he says, look, Jesus wasn't a Pharisee. He wasn't a regular rabbi or teacher. He wasn't one of the Qumran sectarians, a group that lived out of the desert and held to a very particular and high standard of interpreting the Old Testament. These groups of people, all of them, they all interpreted the Old Testament in particular ways, whilst at the same time placing themselves, in theory, underneath its authority. Jesus is doing something different. He's claiming to be the Messiah, again, the King. And he's saying how the Old Testament is taught and interpreted going forward will now be via the Messiah and not another authority. So how are we, in his wake, to read and understand the Old Testament? How do we follow it? We first follow Jesus, and then through him, we follow the Old Testament. And of course, this only makes sense if he really is the Messiah, the fulfillment and completion of everything that had preceded him thus far. 19. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So what is meant here by these commandments? Does Jesus mean everything that has preceded him in the Old Testament or everything that comes after this section in the Sermon on the Mount? Looking at this verse, you'll see that it mentions the term kingdom of heaven, not once, but twice. And the kingdom of heaven, as we know, is a central theme of the book of Matthew and Jesus' teaching. And how to live in the kingdom of heaven is what the Sermon on the Mount is primarily concerned with. So I lean to these commandments in this verse, referring to what follows after this section. And in following those, you also follow the Old Testament as taught by Jesus, the Messiah. And then we have this description of least and greatest in the kingdom, depending on whether you do the commands or not. And this almost reads as if you could relax the commandments and not do them, and if you even taught others not to do the commandments either, you could still be part of the kingdom. You'd just be one of the least. But the early church fathers and later reformers disputed this reading. For them, that term, being least in the kingdom, actually meant being out of it. As in, if you don't do any of this stuff, if you don't follow any of these commandments, then you're out. That was their reading. And what's even more confronting is this idea that perhaps you can be part of the kingdom for a while also, but ejected later. So if you look up further on along in Matthew chapter 8 and 12, in one of the parables there, you read about one of the sons of the kingdom, someone who belongs to this kingdom, being thrown out of the kingdom later. Presumably on the basis of if you stop doing what is being asked, or perhaps never do what is being asked. So what's with all this doing? Is the doing, if you like, is the doing really that important? And that's a fair question. But if you look to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, verses 24 to 27, you have the famous parable of the person who built their house on the sand versus the rock. And this is Jesus' own take on just how important the doing is. So the wise person is the one who hears Jesus' words and puts them into practice. He does the doing. The foolish person, they simply only hear. There's no doing for the foolish person. And Jesus seems to be saying that it's the doing, not the merely assenting, not the repeating, not the head nodding, not the intending, etc., that counts, but the doing. Following Jesus, really following him, that's what counts. Which leads us to the last verse. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And McKnight summarises this verse by saying this, by writing this: your doing must exceed the experts and their doing. And things are already reaching a fever pitch here in the sermon. And now Jesus really, really turns up the heat. Our righteousness, our behaviour, if you like, that conforms to the will of God as expressed by the Messiah Jesus, this righteousness, this behaviour, has to surpass the moral examples of the day. The shock of this verse is probably lost on us today because we're so easily conditioned, if you've had any church experience, to regard the Pharisees and scribes as the bad guys. But look, substitute scribes and Pharisees for Mother Teresa and Gandhi, and you have some idea as to how this would have landed to the audience of the day. You want us to be better doers than the Pharisees. You expect me, Jesus, to outperform the ethics of Mother Teresa. And if I don't, I won't make it into the kingdom. So this has you wondering, of course, what exactly may the Pharisees and scribes have been doing or not doing that earned them Jesus' ire? How were they falling short? Some possible answers is that they were all about the doing, but only on the surface level, only for the sake of appearances. So underneath, they were motivated by pride and greed. Their heart condition, if you like, was poor. And there's plenty of biblical evidence for this. And we know that our righteousness has to be doing the right thing for the right reasons. Also, the scribes and the Pharisees, they both restricted and expanded on the spirit of the laws when it suited them. So, for example, on the one hand, we know they curtailed adultery to the actual act, when Jesus goes on to say that it begins, in fact, with a lustful look. On the other, they taught that divorce was fine if the husband was dissatisfied or suspicious, when Jesus goes on to say that really it had to be justified by infidelity. In summary, they were defining the law, not God. Obviously, there's a bunch of scriptural evidence for this too. But I suppose that our greater risk, if you like, is that we do the same thing when we read the sermon. We can try to restrict what Jesus could mean in what follows in order to make it more comfortable, more domesticated for us. So we too can try to shift the emphasis away on the call to be obedient. So we can say things like, look, the Pharisees were trusting in their own ability to do good. We need to trust in God's grace. And that's so true. But it's also true, I reckon, that can just become a way to try to dodge actually doing the stuff that we're called to do. We can say, Jesus is so much more interested in the heart. And that's also so true. But he doesn't want a less than ideal motivation to become an excuse to never actually get around to doing much. Look, my heart's just not in it, so I'm not even going to try, because that would be insincere, or God forbid, inauthentic. No, we need to do. We need to do. And this isn't so much for our justification as opposed to our sanctification, if you want to look at it that way. And obviously today I'm not spending a lot of time talking about grace or how to even go about the doing, because those two themes aren't covered so much in these 4 verses, but I want to acknowledge that both those things are still important and still in play. McKnight goes as far as to write, we, Jesus' followers, we're supposed to be better than non-followers. We are supposed to be better than non-followers. And if you're like me, your first impulse is to want to push back on that as soon as you hear it. Better than non-followers? That sounds so harsh and so judgmental. But then you remember all the contrasting examples that come immediately after this section of the sermon. You've heard it said that but I tell you So there's our 4 verses. Jesus fulfills the Old Testament and history. He stresses that the Old Testament is still true and relevant. He says that we must follow, we must do what he asks of us through it, and we must do it to an exceptionally high standard. And to be frank, this jars to my modern/postmodern ears. And I imagine that Christian or not, this probably jars a little to your ears as well. I am so used to a particular notion of freedom, of not being obligated to meet any high moral standard that I haven't chosen. Of course I can agree to the fairly general and vanilla values of the day, but it's not like I'm actually ever being assessed or measured on them. And that's what jars about this. I feel, my default is that I feel like I start off in a place of autonomy. All this freedom to choose what I do and how I behave. And I'm the main authority and judge of just how I'm faring on that. And then this, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, follow me and live my way. And as an extra, he's going to judge how I do. And by the way, that's going to involve a pretty high bar. That just seems so harsh and severe to my modern ears. It's not, Matt, you just do you. Or, Matt, just go your own way. Or, Matt, to thine own self be true. It violates at least 2,000 popular memes and probably 300 self-help books right out the gate, just like that. So 2 things on this just to close. The validity of Jesus' call for people to follow him, it all seems to hinge on whether he really is the Messiah, the King, the true fulfillment of the Old Testament. This throws us back to Lewis's classic trilemma. Christ was either Lord/Messiah, a liar, or a lunatic. So let's consider the scenario again. We've got thousands of years of religious tradition. We've got prophets, kings, priests. We've got ritual. An entire nation, the nation of Israel, is built around all of this. And one man, a relative peasant in a backwater occupied territory, says, all of this, all these hundreds of years of worth of tradition, ritual, history, it's actually all about me. I am the fulfillment of everything that's come before. Now that's either supremely deluded, incredibly evil, or true. And it forces us to make a decision about Christ. We just can't sit on a fence holding him at arm's length as a really good moral teacher, a really nice moral example. That doesn't cut it if we really understand the claim that he's making and the call he's putting out in this sermon. It's so much larger than that. However, if it is true, if he really is the King, the Messiah, the fulfillment of the Old Testament, then his call on my life and the curtailing of my perceived freedom would seem to be legit. I don't see much room in between. Have you made a considered, measured decision about how you view Christ? And second, this notion of freedom. Junger's book has a lot to say about this. I guess 400 miles of walking as a vagrant will give you time to think. That contrast that I set up before, that autonomous individual surveying all these options on one side versus obedience to the King Jesus on the other. Is that reality? Is that really how it is? And I think that Junger would say no. He has like this great anecdote in the book of meeting an old guy, a fellow vagrant, on skis in winter. And he had, as well as his skis, he had a snow shovel that was attached to the back of his belt, and all his worldly possessions were on the end of this snow shovel. That was it, his entire life. And he was skiing in the middle of winter. And Junger poses the question, is this guy, the old guy, skis, all his worldly possessions on the back of his snow shovel, is this guy the poorest person in America or the richest when it comes to freedom? Junger says, compare him to a guy who gives decades of his life working 100-hour weeks at a law firm to pay off his $1 million plus house and lifestyle. Who is freer, Junger says, between those two? And this is what Junger wrote about the guy I mentioned at the start, the old man who wanted to join him. Great quote. The inside joke about freedom, he, the old guy, would have found out soon enough, is that you're always trading obedience to one thing for obedience to another. That's great. That is great. What's freedom? It's just trading obediences. Microsoft Word said that wasn't a real word, but I think it sounds good. Trading obediences. You're never really not obedient to anything. You're never really free in the sense of being completely detached from everything. To think you are is just vanity. So the big choice isn't to be free or not. It's determining to what or who you're going to be obedient to and making that call with your eyes open. So Jesus says our righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees and scribes. They were consciously or not obeying their religious tradition, to be greeted in the streets, to be revered by the crowds. All these demands of their ego they were actually obeying. They weren't really free, I'd warrant. They just didn't know what or who they were actually obeying. Or take us. Am I free in the sense that we usually consider free? I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got the regular familial and friend-based ties that bind. I'm subject to the implicit and all-pervasive influence of a multi-million-dollar advertising agency and their incredibly sophisticated algorithms that can read, hijack, and predict my psychology. Thank you, Amazon, for all those great ideas of what I didn't even know I needed or wanted. They're so appreciated. I've got the regular peer pressure to conform and aspire to the same thing as my peer group. And I've got the typical and all too human appetites and drives. Just like you guys, I've got the pros and cons that came with my genetic inheritance, both the cholesterol and the charisma. So am I free in the way that I often conceptualize freedom? And just as importantly, are you guys? I think it's less about getting hung up on freedom and more about, again, who and what I intentionally and consciously try to obey. So again, Christ's call to obedience can seem severe to our modern ears. But if he is who he says he is, it's a fair claim. And perhaps even more comfortingly, given what he preached and how he lives, I'd rather obey and follow him than the alternatives. The demands are high, but they're nothing that he himself didn't exemplify and embody. Jesus fulfilled the law in the Old Testament, and the way he did so was supreme, self-sacrificial love. So it's not a harsh military leader we're following. It's not a grandiose, self-important Silicon Valley tech guru who thinks they know what's best for the world. It's a loving, servant king who has already walked the path he's calling us to follow. Thanks. Let's pray. Father, I thank you once again for your son. I thank you for the life that he lived, the example that he set, but I thank you that he really was the chosen king, the Messiah. And I thank you for the love that he embodied and demonstrated, for the sacrifices that he made. And I pray that you'll help all of us just think and ponder and consider whether we kind of do take him seriously enough. And help us, just be rational and sober about that, Father. And help us do what we can by our intentions, but also the power of your Spirit to follow in his footsteps and to try to orient our lives towards these incredibly challenging but also inspiring standards that he set. Amen.